All right, greetings from Silicon Valley. My name is Nida Atshan. We have with us today Fatma Jaffrey. Very excited to have Fatma with us. She is a lawyer based in the Bay Area. Her background is specifically working with international startups on corporate legal matters, venture financing, and intellectual property transaction. She's currently a legal consultant for Founders Space Incubator in San Francisco and Silicon Valley Pat in Menlo Park. Amongst many other things, I know Fatma's working on a blog that you can feel free to check out. There's a link to the blog on our website, but if you want to check it out right now, it's www.juicingjurist.com. So please do feel free to check that out. The topic for today's conversation is legal structuring, fundraising, and U.S. incorporation matters. If you have any questions for Fatma throughout the webinar, please feel free to send them to us directly on Twitter at techwadi.org. We will also be following the hashtag TWWebinar. So if you have any questions, please do use the hashtag. And with that, I will leave it to Fatma. Thank you so much for being with us today, Fatma.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. So I thought that I would start off with a quick presentation, a quick PowerPoint that I made just outlining different legal and fundraising issues that come up with startups. And I thought this was important because obviously as a lawyer, we like to have a very sound legal foundation, but even for your startup's development, it's really important to understand your different fundraising options. A lot of times people think that they always have to do an equity round, for example, but especially for newer companies and earlier companies, there are a lot of other options such as a convertible note or a SAFE. So I'm just gonna share my screen right now and start the presentation. So one of the biggest and most important thing is to create a legal entity early on. A lot of times founders get really caught up in the IP and the technology and forget to actually create a legal creation. So whether it's in Palestine, whether it's here in the US, it's really important to talk to a lawyer in order to understand what your different options are. And a legal entity will help you limit your personal liability. So if the company goes bankrupt, then you won't be personally liable on your assets. It's important for investors, obviously, investors will only invest in an incorporated legal entity. And it really helps to keep, sound corporate governance and practices at hand and, keeping, adequate corporate records and all of that stuff. And especially if you're fundraising in the US, a lot of times investors will require a Delaware corporation with the international subsidiary. So for example, if all of your development work is in Palestine or Egypt, for example, what we would do is we would create a Delaware corporation and link it to the company in Egypt or Palestine or wherever your development team is. The second one is a little, it's not legal per se, but it's very strategic. And that's really to help to make sure you have the right team in place. And that's not just in the leadership capacities, but that's also your board members and advisors. It's really important not just to get, big name board members and advisors on your team who can't really bring anything to the table. While, it's nice to have a few recognizable names, in my experiences, the companies that have done the best have been the ones who've been a lot more strategic about their partnerships and about who they bring on the board, because those board members and advisors can actually bring something to the table and help the company grow. And I think that's really important, particularly in a very specialized space. So if you're, the next Uber, or if you're, working on something in the transportation sector, then, having someone with that specialty would really be beneficial to introducing you to the right people and also helping to navigate your company and technology. The other thing I would really caution is addressing equity early. A lot of times we have startups working on a project, working on an idea for months, and they haven't really put in writing who owns what. So, it might just be very easy just saying, we own 50-50 if it's you and a co-founder, but actually papering that and having a document. And it's also important to have a stock option pool, which we here have in the US, which is for future employees and particularly early on employees, because you can't pay them the way, any other company, any other larger company would. So you can, supplement their sort of compensation with equity, which is what a lot of startups do. And in order to do so, you'll have to have a sort of a pool that's separated from the founder's pool that's specifically for employees. IP is really important. It's sort of the bread and butter of your technology. And a lot of times, particularly with international startups, we won't see a lot of the paperwork, such as like CIIAs, confidential information, invention assignments, or NDAs put in place with employees and contractors. And that's really important because it really ensures that the company owns all of the inventions and the methods that are produced by the employees or contractors. It's also really important to get paperwork from any previous or prior contractors to confirm that the company itself actually owns the IP. So this part of my presentation is really discussing the three main types of funding options. As I mentioned before, a lot of times startups think that their only options are an equity financing, which is your typical financing where the investor invests a certain amount and gets a percent of the company, and some sort of controlling rights like a board seat and information rights, right of first refusal, all of that. But there are certainly other options for smaller financings as well as sort of newer companies. And those are convertible notes, safes. Safes and KISS are sort of in the same boat, and equity financing, of course. So convertible note it's a short-term debt instrument. So it acts like a debt instrument that converts into preferred shares once the company raises its next round. So for example, it would be, it's usually like an angel round, it's a friends and family round, and they're investing money in right now. And at the next like Series A or Series B, their debt or their investment will convert into preferred stock. The pros are that it's relatively quick to do. It doesn't require as much due diligence and paperwork as an equity financing. So the legal and operating costs are relatively low. And it doesn't value the company early on, which is really important, I think, for companies who want to stay lean and who want to stay attractive for their next equity round. Some of the cons are some investors, particularly international ones, are averse to notes. So they, particularly in India, for example, convertible notes are actually like a Indian tax resident is not allowed to enter into a debt instrument, which is what I'll discuss in my next slide. So sometimes if, if those countries or those regions don't allow for it, we can, issue a safe, for example. And also sometimes the terms are a little hazy, so it's really important to make sure the terms are clear so that subsequent financing rounds are much easier. That leads me to the SAFE and the KISS. So the SAFE was created by Y Combinator and the KISS was created by 500 Startups. And the only difference between these instruments and a convertible note is that it's not considered a debt instrument, so it doesn't have interest or maturity date. So these are really good options for in jurisdictions, for example, where debt financing is illegal. We would enter into a SAFE note or a KISS note. And I guess one of the other cons is that these are relatively new instruments. I think Y Combinator came up with this 5 years ago and 500 Startups as well. So a lot of like the international bankers and investors may not understand this concept yet, but it's definitely catching on and we're seeing it a lot in international markets as well. So the most traditional round of financing is an equity round. And that's really when you sort of raise capital by selling company stocks to investors, and in return for the investments, the investors will receive share interests in the company. Um, and it's usually we see it like 500K and above. Obviously, in every jurisdiction, in every market, it's different, but it's usually between 500K and a million. And some of the pros are that there's no interest attached to it, and it allows for a larger amount of investment. The cons are obviously that you give up part of your company, such as like the board seats and equity. You value the company, and it's certainly a lot more expensive in terms of the legal and operating costs because of the due diligence and paperwork that's required. So this is like an equity financing is really when you have like an institutional investor interested, with a term sheet that you can sign on to. And that's when you would really even consider it. A lot of times we see startups really early on considering equity financing. And at that point in their trajectory, it's not maybe the best decision. So it's really important to think both long-term and short-term in terms of your risk and in terms of your company's development if an equity financing is right for you at that time. So Nida mentioned that I have a blog, and so this is all of my contact information. Nida or Amal can send it out to you. I'm happy to answer any questions now or offline. I know I just gave you a lot of information, so but I'm happy to go over anything or any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Fatma, for that presentation. I do have a question about the role that you play as a lawyer in the investment pitching process. So do you come in early on when an entrepreneur is approaching an investor, or do you come in later to sort of negotiate the final terms? So how does that typically play out?
Sure. Yeah. So it really depends on the client, but I will say that most of the time, the clients and the companies will seek out investors on their own and then bring them in. And then once they're presented with a term sheet, that's really when we get in. But I have certainly like introduced people to, investors or people that I think might be interested. But for the most part, it really is startups doing the legwork, fundraising, and then bringing us a term sheet, and that's when we really get involved.
Okay, and is the extent of your involvement to advise and try to negotiate terms, or do you just kind of take what the entrepreneur wants and go from there? I mean, how much advising do you actually provide?
Sure. Yeah, so we provide, again, it's really dependent on the company, but we certainly do try to advise as much as possible. We've seen a lot of types of deals go through. We've worked with different investors. So we sort of know what's market, what terms are market, what terms are a little more aggressive. So we're obviously aware of the market in which we're operating in, as well as the company itself. But we definitely do try to advise companies and definitely negotiate for them as well. But obviously keeping the founder and company, that's our main priority. So making sure that they're aware of the risks, and then if they're okay with that, then they're the ultimate decision maker.
Right. Okay. Now, with regard to term sheets, I mean, I personally have seen term sheets, and they're not easy to understand off the bat. How do startups go about understanding term sheets? If they're starting from scratch, I mean, how do you recommend they try to learn and understand term sheets?
Sure. Yeah, so this is, again, assuming that startups don't have a lawyer yet, because your lawyer will be able to sort of go through a term sheet. But if they're on their own, I would obviously ask them to take a step back and really ask them to look at their long-term goals and what's important to them. Because in a term sheet, you're going to be, or in a financing, you're going to be giving up something, whether it's a board seat, equity, obviously. And you need to be okay with what you're giving up. So I think understanding the company first, and then understanding what valuation is, what right of first refusal, and there's a lot of resources online. Like Y Combinator does a really good job explaining the safe, for example. And I can send a few links that we use as well. And they really educate founders about a term sheet, negotiating certain terms. And I think that's really important because at the end of the day, the founders need to have a stake in the financing.
Definitely. Thank you. So we have another question. So many of our viewers and the startups that we work with are MENA-based startups. So we have a question from the Middle East about what challenges do you see that MENA startups, or what legal challenges do you see MENA startups face that US-based startups may not face?
Sure. Yeah, so I mentioned the IP issue, and I think a lot of times in MENA and in Asia, a lot of times like the IP, for example, isn't protected in the way as it is here in the US. So I've worked with a lot of startups where they don't necessarily have contracts in place with their development team to ensure that the IP belongs to the company. And that's obviously really important, especially in a financing, because you want to make sure that the company owns the IP, and investors are really keen on that. So I think IP protection is huge. I think access to capital is not an issue per se in MENA, but I think access to smart capital. So not necessarily, just people who have money, but people who have either an interest in startups or an interest in the specific sector that you are working on. And I see that not just in MENA, but I see that sort of in a lot of other regions where there is access to money and there is access to really smart people, but the nexus isn't always there. So it's I do see just like access to advisors and investors who understand the technology sometimes is lacking, which is why something like TechWadi, organizations like TechWadi are so important to really work with countries who aren't in Silicon Valley and really guide them and help them hone their technology and company.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Fatma. That's it for the questions on our end, but I do want to encourage anyone who has questions to send them directly to us at info@techwadi.org, and we can get the answers for you. Otherwise, please contact Fatma directly. She's provided her contact information. So thank you so much, Fatma.
Thank you so much. This was great. Thank you.
Great. Take care. Bye-bye.